Well, Matt, I have a pretty interesting topic today. What do you think is the US's biggest fear right now? Currently, the entire world's pretty scared of disease, but we're also very scared of things we don't know, particularly things we don't know about other countries. This will eventually segue into my topic of torture. I'll explain why it's relevant later, but currently, torture is deemed globally unethical. We've decided that torture just is unethical, but I'm here to tell you that torture isn't always unethical and has some benefits that should be up for discussion. So, today I'll be explaining how torture can overall deter attacks from other countries, prevent national scares, and influence safer communities within the US. So, what comes to your mind when you think of torture? Probably movies like Saw, blood, gore, disgusting human centipedes. Those are all valid forms of physical torture, but I think in order to properly dive into this, we need a universal definition, just so that we're all on the same page. The definition given by the Department of Justice for torture is an act committed by a person acting under the color of the law specifically intended to inflict severe physical or mental suffering upon another person within his custody or physical control. So the main takeaway from that is torture is not only physical, it can be entirely mental. In fact, there's plenty of psychological tortures out there. There's lots of studies. A study I'll be using from the Center for the Study of Human Rights of UC Davis, they listed a bunch of terms that they say qualifies as psychological torture. The list they have is isolation, debilitation, spatiotemporal, sensory deprivation, sensory assault, desperation, threats, degradation, and pharmacological manipulations, of course. Those are all psychological forms of torture that result in no physical damage being dealt. And psychological torture is still deemed unethical because, while the results of psychological torture are completely subjective and vary upon different people, it's still typically seen to be more effective, more harmful, more damaging than physical torture. However, despite this, psychological torture is currently legal in the US right now. They don't call it torture, they call it solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is a form of isolation, which, as seen in the list, is a form of psychological torture. It's used as a punishment to try to keep fighting amongst prison mates to a minimal. So, if we currently consider isolation a reasonable form of torture for deterring crime within the US, I don't think it's too wild to consider other psychological forms of torture to deter crime amongst other countries as well. So let's talk about the common arguments against torture. A lot of people say that torture leads to fake answers, or the victim will only say what the interrogator wants to hear. That's true in most cases, actually. Torture usually leads to false information. However, if even there's a 1 in 10 chance of the information being correct, it's worth taking it if it can save 100 lives. The attack will happen regardless, but if there's even a 10 or 5% chance of stopping it, why not take it? It's saving lives. So I don't know if that argument is completely valid. I think the most valid argument against torture is questioning its ethics. Is torture ethical? I think most people say it's not. In fact, I would assume that every single person watching this video right now would say that torture is unethical. Even if 10 out of 10 times the torture stops the crime from happening, it's still just unethical. We shouldn't do it. And I think that standpoint is a little contradictory of current US policies in place right now. Because in US, as I said earlier, people are saying torture is unethical, physical or psychological, but isolation is a form of psychological torture that people deem ethical, constitutional. It's legal right now. And as of 2014, all 50 states have legalized disciplining of children. This is beating, spanking, hitting, causing physical harm to defenseless beings. And the term that the Massachusetts Supreme Justice Court used in their law is reasonable force, a very vague term. It can be interpreted however the reader wants to. So, not very strong laws restricting the form of physical harm to our children, and people are okay with that. And outside of the US, we have Singapore, which has caning in effect. Basically, in Singapore, as a form of punishment, they cane, they beat their crime offenders for committing a certain crime. It's not so much about the punishment, it's the fact that it deters crime. And it works in Singapore. In the past century, Singapore's crime rates have dropped almost exponentially, and now they have one of the lowest crime rates in the entire world, with caning currently in effect. So as you can see, these mild forms of torture are currently accepted as punishment, even though most people consider torture unethical. So I don't see if these three examples of torture are ethical, what's stopping the other forms of torture from being ethical if they can save lives potentially. So basically, my main point, torture is an effective way to deter future crimes. And I think a lot of people say it's similar to the death penalty, which we no longer have in the US. It's been banned, but I think this is different. We all know the death penalty didn't work at all, that's why it was banned. But the torture penalty is different. While the death penalty was a permanent solution, it just eliminated the problem. However, psychological torture, it alters your state of mind, changes morals completely. Torture fixes the problem where the death penalty failed. Thank you.